then. Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Nigel Eask, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Tuesday lunchtime talk at the Hunterian. It's a great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Murray Pittock, Pro-Vice Principal at the University of Glasgow and Bradley Chair of English Literature. Professor Pittock is widely published expert on Scottish and especially Jacobite history, culture, and literature. And his research has been invaluable to the whole Old Ways, New Roads project. We've learned from him in all sorts of ways. Some recent publishing highlights from Murray are his Enlightenment in a Smart City, Edinburgh's Civic Development, 1660 to 1750, the Scots Musical Museum for the Oxford Robert Burns edition, and his acclaimed Culloden, published in Oxford's Great Battles series. I do recommend these titles to you if you haven't already read them. Outside the university, Murray sits on the board of the National Trust for Scotland. He's the Trust's advisor on Scottish history. He's also acted as advisor to the National Galleries and held grants in English, history, museology, tourism, and the creative economy. So Murray is currently working on a project about the British occupation of Scotland in the 18th century, and he'll be sharing his research with us at his talk. And his title is the wonderful, a quote, "If you withdraw the Dragoons, I dare not answer for the town of Leiths continuing in quiet, the British Army in Scotland, 1746 to 60. So over to you, Piers Murray. Looking forward to this very much.
Thanks very much, Nigel, and thank you everyone for making the time to come along this weekend. This will very much be a headline tour of the British Army in Scotland after 1746, and it will start very briefly with Culloden itself. There'll be some reference to maps and mapping, and particularly something which I think is very important and comes across very well in the Old Ways, New Roads project, which is that how contemporaries saw the landscape is just as important as what the landscape was like. And contemporaries saw the landscape, as I think that project demonstrates, somewhat differently from ourselves. So I'll just move on here. The first thing I wanted I just put in Glenfinnan so you could have that romantic moment where it all started. But on the left-hand side, the image of Scotland from relatively contemporary, it's slightly earlier, it's 1720s, map of Great Britain and Ireland indicates very clearly how much larger Scotland, we're north of the Great Glen. Sorry, we seem to be not getting full. Everything going according to plan now. North of the Great Glen appeared to be to contemporaries, the fact it was. You might call it, there are issues, of course, with the projection of the period, but in a way you might also call it, in the years when Scotland was mapped intensively from the late 17th century onwards, in its various ways, a bias of fear towards what we now think of, and still often called the Highlands. Here, by contrast, is a contemporary map, the Traveller's Companion to England and Wales, from, this is actually 1750, where the furthest advance of the Jacobite army in Derby is marched, and this, as you can see immediately, is a great deal more accurate than the contemporary mapping of Scotland. Nigel was kind enough to mention this. This is the folio edition of Culloden, which is out next year. I'm going to start with Culloden and the site itself. The point about the site, I'm not going to talk about the battle today, time doesn't allow it, but the point about the site is that then as now, it was a very open site. In the left-hand image, you can see that the Murray Firth is very visible from the place where the Jacobites stood. And being visible, the Jacobites were equally visible to the Royal Navy, who cluttered up that Firth in strength on the evening of 15th April 1746 and delayed the Jacobite night attack. But also, because the Royal Navy were well equipped with observation posts, telescopes, masts and such like, there's an enormous openness to the battlefield, which you can see here on the right-hand shot in Culloden. The further end of the Jacobite line, there's a remarkable openness to the battlefield which remains today. In other words, when the battle was over, the Jacobites were immediately extremely visible and extremely vulnerable, especially if they ran down the road to Inverness, as far too many did, rather than doing what the surviving units did, which was to cross the Nairn and climb the rise on the other side. The battle itself, I just wanted to note, this is a contemporary French officer's map, probably done in 1746 to 1748. On the left-hand side is l'armée écossoise. On the right-hand side, l'armée angloise. Without going into detail about the reception of Culloden, one of the issues in that reception has been that nobody had very much problem with Culloden being a Scottish-English battle until the 1960s. If you look even at how that the charmingly remote David Niven 1948 reading put it, the presentation that Niven put in 1948 was extremely Scottish-English, patriotic versus Union. It was only really in the 1960s that the now extremely dominant Civil War version of events came into being. And one suspects very strongly that the need to see the Culloden as a civil war is coeval with the rise of a serious threat to the political settlement that it originally endorsed and emplaced. And there is a contemporary move, very good, in fact, the most complete map we have of the actual movement of the battle on the day. The important thing I wanted to notice there is that over where Cobham and Kingston's light horse are standing, who attempted the envelopment on the Jacobite left, that is the site, if you visit Culloden today, for which the View Hill luxury housing development was given permission, and where 6 luxury detached houses are now resting on the spot where Cumberland's banner, headquarters banner, was displayed, and where Cobham and Kingston's Dragoons and Light Horse charged. Now, the first thing before we go to the aftermath of Culloden, to remember back who was at Culloden is that the battle is often misunderstood by reference to the government, or even worse, the Hanoverian army facing the Jacobite army. The Hanoverian army is particularly worth pushing back against, since there was a Hanoverian army, which unsurprisingly was the army of Hanover, which, as anyone who knows British history in the 18th century will know, is entirely written out of the histories that we inherit, even though Hanover, of course, remained directly a British part of the British dominions until 1837, and indirectly for some lengthier period after that. In fact, of course, Bismarck's incorporation of Hanover would not have been possible had Salic law not meant that Queen Victoria could not have held on to its crown in 1837. But the important issue is at Culloden that it is a British army facing a Jacobite army. And it's a British army because many of those who fought alongside Cumberland had previously fought the same men on the other side at Fontenoy only a year previously. So so Culloden is in a sense not just a grudge match between Jacobites and Hanoverians, it's a grudge match between Britain and France. It's an international conflict in which French regulars and British regulars are deployed. So the Royal Scots are at Fontenoy, they're the front line at Culloden. The Scots Fusiliers are at Fontenoy, they're the front line at Culloden. Handesides, front line at Culloden. Semple's second line in Culloden. Howard's second line in Culloden. Blythe's, Cholmondeley's and Putney's third line in Culloden, together with Hawley's and Bland's Dragoons and the Inniskillings. A significant proportion, in fact, quite a large proportion of the British Army on the day fought at Fontenoy on 11th May 1745. Now, if you wanted to think about the amount of fear the Jacobites generated and the amount of anxiety they generated, that largely came about because doomed to defeat as the Jacobite cause has perpetually been seen since the 18th century. In global terms, at the time, it was truly critical in the sense that the victory for the Jacobites, not at Culloden, but an overall victory of the Jacobites, might very well have completely changed the terms of the struggle between Great Britain and France in the 18th century, and as such, changed the face of Europe, and indeed, possibly changed the history of France, though I haven't got time to go into that, in an enormously significant way, not least because of the effects of the Revolution and Bonaparte. And of course, here, this was done for Cumberland. Moyer's painting of the troops was done for Cumberland. This is Barrel's regiment apparently being broken on the British left. It doesn't look very breakable at present. And of course, the image of the Highlander on the ground, raising his leg just to suggest both his virility and the fact that he may be wearing nothing under his kilt. But far from the swords and non-existent Lochaber axes deployed in that painting, here are actually some recently recovered French and Spanish caliber musket ball from the site on which, for which planning permission has just been sought for a hot tub and outside lodge. So we're looking at a major military threat to the British government, and a major military threat to the state, and also one which is a continuation and part of the conflict between Great Britain and France for overall dominance in the European theatre. We're talking about one where the Jacobites is important, and there I put up some of the surrender data and the confiscated materiel, which included, for example, on the 19th of August at Stirling, 22 pieces of Jacobite artillery, the largest being an 18-pounder, and the various other forms of munitions and guns which were gathered in, as indicating that actually, when it came to Jacobite surrenders, one finds that Highlanders with swords are the very least of it. And the fact that the front rank, the officers carried swords, as indeed their British compatriots would do, is something we still over-focus on, because it fits the symbolism of dehumanization and marginalization, which was present not just from the battle, but actually from before the battle. On the British side itself, Colonel Wolfe noted that as few prisoners were taken as possible, and Cumberland noted that Bland's men gave quarter to none, but about 50 French officers and soldiers. Something like twice as many Jacobites died in the aftermath of the battle as on the battle itself. But this had been not just a brush of blood to the head. This had been long in planning. As long ago as the 12th of December, 1745, 4 months before the battle, Cumberland had noted that because the Jacobites held so many British prisoners, he did not care to put any Jacobite prisoners to death, but encouraged the country people to do it. In February in Perth, he was so convinced that large proportion of the population were Jacobite that he mused on the best way to accelerate speedy punishment of these wretches who were the greatest part of the common people. So with too many for the criminal justice system to deal with, for some reason it's really jumping around, so my apologies for that. He had already planned 31st of March in the Cumberland Papers that the whole government and constitution in these parts of the kingdom shall be changed. And that began to happen the day after Culloden. Only 154 prisoners were taken in total from the Scottish regiments, and there were hardly any wounded prisoners who were not Irish or Scottish regulars in the French service. On the battlefield itself, there were direct executions by firing squad, 36 deserters hanged, 32 burned alive. We recently discovered those burned alive may have included Colonel O'Reilly, although he was an Irishman in the French service, had the misfortune to be attached to Lord Ogilvy's Forfarshire Regiment, and also the Jacobite officers Mingus of Sheern and Stewart of Kynecan. The Synod of Murray almost immediately advised all its Presbyterian ministers to be very careful in noting the guilt of anyone involved in the rising. So remembering that a lot of the primary material for who went out in the rising are reports from local ministers from their parishes, they have to be really hard line to mention everybody, because already, and Murray was not alone, the Presbytery of Culloden, for example, thought the minister should accept bare assurances of innocence to justify certifying the good conduct of their parishioners. Ministers did not, the indications are, report everybody who'd been out in the rising, because they knew what was likely to happen to them. Although Major General Bland in his 1743 treatise on military discipline had talked about the need for a respectful attitude by occupying military forces towards the civilian population, 3 years later he wrote to Loudon to destroy all persons you can find who have been in the rebellion or their abettors. So you can see that we're in a situation which was already very serious from the point of view. I'm not, as I say, apologies about this. So I put this map on because I just want to raise a doubt. I'm going to just demonstrate that the British Army occupied the whole of Scotland, not just in the Highlands. What I want to demonstrate about this is a pretty crude 19th century map of Scotland with a Highland line as defined by the 1784, I think 1784 Act on whisky duty, etc. on it. One of the things about the Highland line people never ask, and I just leave this with you, is that it cuts through counties. It cuts through Scotland's civil administrative boundaries. So I think it's important to note that the civil boundaries of Scottish government and administration apparently straddle what are sometimes still thought of as two culturally irreconcilable and linguistically highly differentiated cultures. That was not how they were seen at the time. So there's extensive, by land and sea, the Royal Navy's used the Royal Navy's used extensively wasting, harrying immediately after Culloden. And I think that's well enough known, so I'm not going to go into the details of it there. One of the things that seems to happen is that Major Lockhart, who's one of the worst offenders, is shot by a sniper, and that action that is taken against British officers, which includes murder or assassination, is more likely to be taken against Scots in the service of the British Army than it is against Englishmen, interestingly enough, but perhaps not altogether surprisingly. But one of the things that happens almost immediately is a decision is taken to occupy large areas of Scotland. And here is where the story of the aftermath of Culloden, the harrying of the Highlands, all the rest of it, runs up against its first set of facts. So Lord Mark Kerr's Dragoons are dispatched from Inverness not to occupy the West Highlands, but to Fochabers, Cullen, Banff, Fraserburgh and Peterhead. Viscount Cobhams have already left for Aberdeen, Brechin, Forfar, and Berwick, Stonehaven, as well as Montrose. Major General St George has a number of troops from different regiments at Arbroath, Cooper Angus and Glamis. Major General Hamilton sent to Dundee with 6. Colonel Nezons as men at Crieff, Stirling and Drummond Castle. Mordaunt goes to reinforce Perth with 3 battalions and 5 pieces of artillery on the 13th of May, and Cumberland then moves a little bit later to Fort Augustus. But actually, if you look at this moving, this is done by the Stennis Historical Society, who've digitized a great many of the British Army or orders of the day and allocations in the period. This is a moving GIF of the posts, fortifications, long-term and temporary camps. Actually, the 1755 has now been expanded, but I didn't have a GIF for the latest version, which came out 2 days ago. Throughout the period, you can basically see that we are talking about a national occupation. within that occupation, Cumberland and his commanders were very keen to move troops around every 3 months, never mind the Foreign Office's 3 years, every 3 months or so, to prevent connections which may happen by their staying too long in a place, particularly Scotland. I like that bit. And also favoured concentrations of troops which could provide a sense of awe. But basically, they didn't want fraternising or the creating of enduring sexual relationships with the natives. At the same time, of course, there were extensive, from those who had been captured or brought into captivity after the Battle of Culloden itself, sometimes quite a distance after, there was the prospect of being transported and confinement in the Tilbury hulks, where the mortality rate was around about 70%. Those who were transported, interestingly, here are some from the list who were liberated by, from the veteran of Martinique by a French privateer, George Keith, the 35-year-old Aberdeen shoemaker who'd served in Glengarries, William Bell, a Berwickshire bookseller, but also Anne Cameron, Flora Cameron, Barbara Campbell, Jane McIntosh, and Mary MacDonald. People are familiar with the unnatural women aspect of the rising in 1746, with the stories of Jenny Cameron or of Colonel Anne McIntosh. What they're less familiar with is the fact that women who had certainly not been guilty of treason under the terms in which it was understood, or being in arms against the crown, were transported. Sometimes they were noted with a regimental attachment, however, presuming that they were the wife or mistress of one of the soldiers of that regiment. Meanwhile, a significant number of Jacobites joined one of the 3 Scottish regiments in the French service under Ogilvy, Drummond and Lochiel. The Master of Lovat was offered a 4th, but joined the British Army instead. He'd learned a great deal from his father. Cumberland was very, very certain that what had to be done was definitive and would change things forever. It's an absolute necessity. The new laws, for example, against tartan and the suspension of heritable jurisdictions, take place before His Majesty's forces quit this country, and I flatter myself within a month or 6 weeks at longest, we shall have done all that can be done by the military. He wrote on the 23rd of April, 1746, the military were to stay for a further 20 years. Nonetheless, Cumberland himself left for England on the 18th of July. Scotland was divided into 4 military divisions, with over 12,000 troops remaining there, which was 25% of the British Army's regular strength. And this is when the War of the Austrian Succession is still continuing. It included, I've got the deployments there, which are quite substantial. They're not token deployments by any manner of means. They amount to around 20 battalions and 5 Dragoon-led regiments at 71 locations throughout Scotland. By the autumn, there were 22 regiments in Scotland, only 4 of whom were in the customary Highlands. But then, of course, those are some of the cantonments for the British Army on the left-hand side of the great map of Roy's Great Map of Scotland. But if you look at that map, and here, of course, one is looking at variously at North Berwick and Aberdeen, you'll see that Scotland, maybe the Highlands of Scotland is bigger than we ever guessed, because the contours and the presentation of the landscape is such as to give the distinct impression, not just in the north of Scotland, but very much in the south, that this is, and the east, that this is a mountainous terrain. Now, the situation therefore continued to be very challenging. Both General Bland and Andrew Fletcher favoured army officers taking over justices of the peace in the localities and made little headway. And that, in fact, made little headway even in 10 years. The view there was no JP willing to assist the army was echoed in complaints made in 1753, 54, and indeed JPs frequently intervened during the compulsory levying of men to join the Highland regiments in 1756, 57 to deny the legitimacy of their enrolment in the British Armed Forces. Meanwhile, there are units of the Jacobite army remain in the field. Jacobite soldiers are reported in public with weapons surrenders in the Mearns into 1748. Tartans go on sale in Edinburgh in particular in great profusion, just as they had after 1715. There's an advertisement there from James Bailey's shop on the 24th of November 1748, and enlistment in the French service continued. So one of the interesting things I just wanted to point out briefly in bypassing it is that Struan Robertson, or Alexander Robertson Struan, died in 1749 on an estate from which he'd been deprived many years earlier. But when it came to the British government taking charge of Struan's rents at last from that estate, 2 captains and 40 men of boroughs at Perth, combined with some 65 to 70 from the Crieff and Dunkeld outposts, were sent to join an existing party of soldiers at Tay Bridge to assist Mr. Ramsay, appointed factor for the Crown, upon the forfeited estate of the late Struan Robinson in raising the funds applicable to law. Mr. Ramsay needed all the help he could get if he needed 150 troops to collect rents from an estate of which the occupant had been allegedly deprived 35 years earlier. Soldiers were typically billeted or barracked in boroughs or outstations. There are some details. We got the size of the tents. They often were billeted in temporary huts. The huts tended to suffer destruction, despoliation, fire, or other accidents when unoccupied. The weather in Scotland is very unreliable. And partly as a response, Corgarth in Strathdon was bought by the government in 1748 for the accommodation of soldiers. And guess what? Winter postings in Corgarth were not popular. One of the notes that, which further down the page is where there were 45 men, is that there was not one necessary available for the officers. So there's absolutely, not even for officers, no facilities, nothing but a bare room, neither bed nor bedding, which in Corgarth in December is pretty nippy, I can tell you, though not from personal experience. Sometimes I think I would think of the 4 privates at the foot of Loch Shiel posting, spending 4 months together in a hut over winter as one of the other particularly bad deals offered to the British Army at this time. There were quite a lot of desertions, quite a lot of punishments. I can't dwell on those. One of the interesting things I wanted to mention in the bygang, though, is the extent to which even Scotland's greatest magnates could be both infuriated and craven by turns in the face of the occupation. James Maitland, 7th Earl of Lauderdale, a copper-bottomed Whig, and himself a former Lieutenant Colonel of the 16th Foot and one of 16 representative peers, wrote to General Churchill on 9th October 1751 to explain how he came to beat a soldier and apologise for it, asking that his letter of explanation should not be used in the event of any legal case, as it was, quote, the real truth, which is the thing they never make use of at law. In the end, Churchill accepted his explanation and Lauderdale promised a guinea to the soldier by way of compensation. But if one of Scotland's greatest magnates is almost crawling on his belly for assaulting a private soldier in the British Army, one can imagine the general atmosphere that prevailed. And the quote that titles this talk comes here, again writing to General Churchill on 8th December 1751. The Lord Provost Drummond in Edinburgh pleaded that if you withdraw the Dragoons, I dare not answer for the town of Leiths, continuing in quiet. That is less than a year, few months in fact, before the proposals for the new town, part authored by Drummond, were published. From the Enlightenment city of the heavenly philosophers to the hairy flea-ridden rebels of a lost generation seems to be a matter of a few months. We need to reconsider, as ever, our Scottish 18th century. With the deteriorating situation in North America, in November 1755, Chelsea pensioners residing in Scotland were examined at Edinburgh to see whether they were fit for garrison duty. The majority, of which the oldest was 102, were assessed as unable to perform any duties, but a significant minority, for example, 71 from the 190 Chelsea pensioners assessed at Perth, were passed for light, typically garrison duty. I'm sorry, can you see there? Can you see the slides at all? Hello?
Yes, if we can see you're scrolling through them, Murray.
Good. I hope that's all right.
Yep.
Okay. They seem to be. They're really very jumpy. So obviously, Fort George. Fort George is the last exemplar and very expensive exemplar of the major period of the occupation. And I don't have time to go over the details of how the occupation passed into the recruitment of Scottish soldiers into the British Army, except to say that the issue of recruiting them into the British Army in order to make the north of Scotland fully governable and to be able to withdraw British troops was still a live one in the 1750s. It was a political necessity to do this. Because in 1768, oatmeal, firing, candles, and other supplies was still being ordered for garrisons at Braemar, Corgarth, Inversnaid, and elsewhere. Robert Burns was 9. Ossian was already a cult. Thank you.